Hi weaving friends, today I wanted to share with you a couple of warping tips that I think will make a big difference to your warping experience. They're so simple and easy to follow, but they could make all the difference for you. Okay, so my first tip is to spread your warp out over more than one peg. For a long time when I was a newer weaver, I just used one single peg when I was direct warping. These are the pegs here. If you already have a rigid Heddle loom and you've done anything with it, you will recognize this as a direct warping peg. So what I've got here is, for this particular warp that I'm setting up, I have two pegs and they're spaced out not to the full width of the warp, but sort of in between, so that the outside of the warp on this side is coming in a little bit at an angle, and it will be doing the same on the other side. But originally I would have put a direct warping peg smack bang in the middle and just done all the warp to that one peg, no matter how wide my warp was actually going to be. And that's okay if it's a really narrow warp, like say if it's for a scarf. Even for a scarf, if it's 10 inches, 8 inches, I will usually spread it over two pegs still. Today I'm making a warp of over 14 inches width, and so it definitely pays off for me to use two warping pegs. So why would I use two warping pegs? What's the difference? Okay, so imagine that I've got my single peg in the middle here, and all of these warp threads are traveling from right over the left of the loom to right over the right of the loom, and everything in between, all traveling to this single point. Well, what happens is that the threads end up traveling different distances. The distances aren't huge, but there is enough over the space of the warp that when you actually get to winding your warp on, if you've only used a single peg, you'll find that your warp ends are all kind of different lengths, and you end up cutting them to the same length for threading, because that's nice and tidy, and you want all of your threads straight and the same length for when you do your threading. But what happens is you end up probably cutting off a bit more than is really necessary, because some of those threads are longer. They've traveled further to get to that central point than other threads have. So by distributing the warp over these two pegs, you will find that when you go to roll on your warp and then you're ready to thread, that you won't have to cut very much off the ends of the warp to make it tidy and straight and ready for threading. The other thing is, if you have a lot of warp threads, or you have a bulky yarn, or whatever it is that you're using, you can find that a single peg can get pretty loaded with that warp, all those loops going around that one central peg. So another benefit of having two pegs or more than one peg is that you don't have so much warp on one peg. And that kind of relates to my next warping tip as well. So the next tip relates to your tension on the yarn as you're taking it to the warping peg. There's a common misconception that this is part of your warp tensioning process, that your warp has to be very tight and very firm at this part of the warping when you're actually making the warp. But that's not really correct. The real tensioning of the warp occurs when you actually start winding the warp onto the loom, rather than this part. So you think of this part as making your warp rather than tensioning your warp, ready to be tensioned perfectly on the loom for weaving. And so you want to have more of a gentle touch rather than a firm touch with your yarn when you're placing it on the peg. Now you do want to be consistent with your warp. You don't want to have a bunch of saggy threads and a bunch of tight threads. That's not going to help you to make a really good, neat warp either. But at the same time, if you tension too tightly, you're going to have some potential problems. One of them can be that if you wind your warp too tightly around the peg each time, eventually it's going to get to a point, it's probably edging further and further towards your loom. Even though this peg is clamped on the table, there's only so much tension that it can take, and this may have happened to you already. It's certainly happened to me as a newer weaver, and what a surprise it is when it happens. The warping peg pops off the table and your warp just goes to spaghetti, and then you've got an awful mess to sort out and you feel very sorry for yourself. So I don't want that to happen to you. And it doesn't need to happen to you because you don't need to have your warp threads really tight at this point. Another thing that can happen if your threads are going too tightly around the peg is when you come to lift them off the peg, if your peg is still in place, which hopefully it is, but you come to get it off and it's really hard. You've got to kind of work the threads off because they're so tightly wound around there. That's not what you want either. There's no particular rule about how tight or how loose you should take your threads around, but just as a simple test, I like to be able to get a couple of fingers in behind the warping peg. Then I know that everything's going to be okay when I come to lift it off. So a way that I control my tension when I'm using the warping peg to make sure that it doesn't get tighter and tighter as I go, which can happen, is I always have my yarn feeding freely off the cone. Usually for me that's on a cone stand. I have directions, my husband and I, for how to make your own cone stand. If you're interested, I'll leave the links down below for that. But some way to have your yarn feeding freely off the cone so that it's not getting any unnecessary tension. And then after I've pulled the loop through the slot, I like to put 2 fingers into the loop and then just pull that gently and walk with it towards the peg. I'm not struggling with the yarn or anything, and it's just feeding freely off that cone and through my fingers, and then I can just pop it gently onto the peg. Another question that you might have would be, when do I change from one peg to the other? So at the moment I'm warping, when I stand behind the loom, I'm warping the right hand side of the loom, and so it makes sense that I'm using the right hand peg. When I get to the middle mark, that's when I swap over. I have my middle mark marked out on my heddle. I swap over to the other peg and I just start using that one instead. This one stays put. And then once you've finished making your warp, you can take both of them off and just treat them as one warp, depending on how you're going to be doing your rolling on, whether you're doing it by yourself or with assistance. Now, to take the 2 peg thing a little bit further, you can also use a multiple peg warping setup, which also works really well because it does what this does, but it does it even better. So imagine if you've got a peg, maybe you've got 4 pegs in place of these 2, then you're going to have your warp coming out nice and straight, and there's going to be very minimal wastage, and it's all going to be really nice and neat. So some people like to make their own warping peg boards. Very simple, just a long piece of wood with pegs driven into it at regular intervals. Some people I've seen use a coat rack, that comes already with the pegs already in. There's a bunch of different things that you can use if you're interested in trying out that method. Well friends, I hope this video was informative to you, and if it was, don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave me a comment down below if you have a question or you just want to comment on today's video. And until next time, happy weaving.